He told the detective, without any shame, without even lowering his voice, that he had asked my 9-year-old daughter to leave because she embarrassed him in front of his business partners. That was the word he used. Embarrassed. Like she was an inconvenience he could just set outside with the recycling bins. What he didn't say was that it was 31 degrees that night. What he didn't say was that she had no coat. What he didn't say was that she stood on that front porch for 2 hours before a neighbor 3 houses down noticed a small child sitting on cold concrete steps, arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. That neighbor called 911. The police called me. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without knowing what kind of family I grew up in. My father built his wealth the old-fashioned way, inherited a small manufacturing company from his father, then spent 40 years expanding it into something that employed over 300 people across 2 states. By the time I was in middle school, we lived in a 6-bedroom house in Naperville, Illinois, with a circular driveway and a guest cottage that was bigger than most people's first apartments. My father was the kind of man who believed that money communicated everything he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. Affection, approval, punishment. It all came through financial channels. I was the younger of 2 daughters, and from the time I was old enough to understand the difference, I understood that I was not his favorite. My older sister, Portia, was everything my father wanted in a child: agreeable, decorative, and completely uninterested in challenging him. She laughed at his jokes. She asked his opinion before making decisions. She married a man named Clifford, who wore the same brand of watch my father wore and said things like "Sir" unprompted. I, on the other hand, went to Northwestern on an academic scholarship, graduated with a degree in forensic accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first attempt, and took a job with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before I was 25. My father did not attend my graduation. He said he had a prior commitment. I later found out he spent that weekend on a golf trip with Clifford. None of that is context, that's just background noise. The real story starts with my daughter, June. June was 9 when it happened. She is the kind of child who collects facts about deep-sea creatures and reads chapter books during car rides and asks questions that make adults visibly uncomfortable because they don't know the answers. Her father, my ex-husband, a man I will not waste a single paragraph on, had been out of the picture since she was 4. It had been just the 2 of us for 5 years. She was my whole world, and I say that not as a cliché but as a literal accounting of how I structured my entire life. When my father invited us to his annual Christmas party that December, I almost declined. We lived in D.C. by then, and the flight to Chicago with a 9-year-old in the week before Christmas is its own particular form of suffering. But my mother called and said it would mean a lot to him, and I made the mistake I always make with my family, which is believing them when they say things like that. We arrived on a Friday evening. The house was exactly as I remembered it, aggressive in its size, immaculate in a way that felt more like a warning than a welcome. My mother hugged me the way she always did, with her whole arms but none of her attention, her eyes already moving past me to whatever needed to be managed next. Portia air-kissed my cheek. Clifford shook my hand like I was a vendor he was being polite to. June, to her credit, was wonderful. She complimented my mother's ornament collection. She asked my father a question about the company that genuinely surprised him. Something she'd read about supply chain logistics, and for about 30 seconds he looked at her with something approaching real interest. Then Portia and Clifford's twin boys arrived with the energy of a natural disaster, and all attention shifted. The twins, 13 years old, private school polished and utterly without accountability, had decided before we even sat down for dinner that June was their target for the weekend. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way they talked over her, the way they laughed at an inside joke whenever she said something. June is not the kind of child who breaks easily, but I watched her get quieter as the evening went on, and I recognized that quietness because I used to do it too. That withdrawal. That recalibration of how much space you're allowed to take up. Saturday was the party. My father had 30 or 40 guests, business associates, neighbors, people from his club. The house was full and loud and smelled like expensive candles and catered food. I spent most of the evening near the kitchen, talking to a woman who had worked with my father for years and was far more interesting than anyone else in the room. I lost track of June for about 40 minutes. That is the fact I have to live with. 40 minutes. What I learned later, from June, from my father's own statement to the police, and from a security camera my father had installed above his study door that he apparently forgot existed, was this: the twins had gone into my father's study and taken a crystal paperweight off his desk. A heavy one, shaped like a globe, that he'd received as an award from some business association. They knocked it off the shelf, it hit the floor, and a piece chipped off the base. Then they walked out, found June in the hallway, and told my father that they had seen her drop it. My father did not ask June what happened. He did not ask the twins for their version. He did not seek me out or give her the basic dignity of a conversation. He walked June to the front door of his house, told her that he did not allow destructive children at his events, and told her to wait outside until I could be found. It was 31 degrees. She had no coat because she'd left it in the guest room. She was 9 years old, and he put her outside like something he wanted off his property. When I tell you that I did not know that I was 40 feet away laughing at something that woman from accounting said, completely unaware that my child was sitting on a concrete step in the freezing dark, that is the thing that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning. Not what he did, not what happened next. Just that 40 minutes. The neighbor who called 911 was a woman named Mrs. O.C. She had a daughter herself, she told the officer later, and she simply could not drive past a child sitting alone outside in the cold. She brought June inside, wrapped her in a blanket, gave her hot chocolate, and waited with her until the police arrived. I got the call at 8:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at my watch when my phone rang and thought, who is calling from an Illinois number I don't recognize? The officer on the phone was very calm and very clear. He told me that my daughter had been found alone outside a residence on Birchwood Court, that she was safe and warm and with a neighbor, and that I needed to come to the address immediately. He did not tell me she was okay in a way that meant anything. He told me she was physically unharmed, which is a different thing entirely. I was in my car before he finished the sentence. June was sitting on Mrs. O.C.'s couch when I got there, holding a mug with both hands, and when she saw me she did not cry. She just said, "Mom," in the voice she uses when she has been holding herself together for a long time and my face gives her permission to stop. I held her for a long time. I did not go back to my father's house that night. The officer took my statement in Mrs. O.C.'s kitchen. He was professional and thorough, and when I told him about my father, who had said what, when, he wrote everything down without any particular expression on his face, and then he told me that the responding officers had already spoken with my father briefly, and that there would be a follow-up. What the officer did not know, and what my father almost certainly did not know, was what I did for a living. I spent 8 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I then spent 4 years as a senior investigator with the Treasury Department's Office of Financial Crimes. I have testified before Congress. I hold 2 federal certifications that most people have never heard of and would require a significant explanation to understand. I know exactly how financial crimes are investigated, which means I know exactly how they are committed, and I know how to find the evidence when someone believes they have hidden it. My father's company had been under informal review for 11 months. This is the part I need to explain carefully because it is complicated and it matters. I had not been assigned to his case. I want to be very clear about that. But forensic accounting is a small world, and I knew the investigator who had been quietly building a file on Hartwell Manufacturing for most of the previous year. The irregularities had started small. Vendor payments that didn't quite reconcile. A subsidiary in Delaware that appeared to exist only on paper, consulting fees paid to an LLC that investigators could not connect to any actual consulting work. My father was not the primary target of the investigation. Clifford was. Clifford, it turned out, had been systematically siphoning money from the company for almost 4 years, skimming from vendor accounts, billing ghost employees, moving funds through the paper subsidiary in ways that were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but fell apart under serious scrutiny. My father had either known and looked the other way, or had been so confident in Clifford's management of the subsidiary that he had never looked closely enough. Both possibilities were being investigated. Neither man knew how close the net had gotten. I spent the first 3 days after the party doing what I should have done immediately, which was focusing entirely on June. We stayed at a hotel. We ordered room service. We watched movies and she slept in my arms, and I let her talk about what happened, and I let her not talk about it when she didn't want to. She asked me once, on the second night, whether Grandpa had known how cold it was. I told her I didn't know. She nodded slowly and went back to watching her movie, and I understood that she was filing that information somewhere she would process later, which is exactly what I would have done at her age. On the 4th day, I made 2 calls. The first was to my colleague in Chicago, the investigator on the Hartwell case. I did not interfere with his investigation. I did not offer information or request favors. What I did was ask him very precisely about the timeline and whether the documentation I was aware of from my own prior consultation on a related case could be formally shared. He told me it could. He thanked me. The second call was to an attorney, not a family law attorney. A federal litigator, one of the best in the country, who I had worked with on 2 previous cases and who had made a point of telling me, after both of them, to call her if I ever needed anything. Her name was Renata. Wait, I need to stop myself. Her name was Sylvie. She'd been practicing white-collar criminal defense and prosecution for 22 years, and she listened to me describe what had happened to June for about 4 minutes before she said, "Tell me about the sister and the husband." I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll clear my calendar for Thursday." My mother called me 5 times in those 4 days. I did not answer. My father called once. I did not answer. Portia sent a text message that said simply, "The boys feel terrible and want to apologize." I did not respond. On Thursday, I drove to Naperville. I had arranged, through Sylvie's office, a meeting at my father's house. I had told my mother, who I finally called back on Wednesday evening, that I wanted to discuss what had happened with the whole family present. She had sounded relieved. She used the word closure twice. I arrived at 11 in the morning. My father was in his study. My mother had made coffee. Portia and Clifford were in the living room. Clifford in the chair my father always sat in when he wanted to signal authority. Portia next to him with her hands folded like she was already practicing looking reasonable. The twins were not there. I had specifically requested they not be. I sat down. I put my bag on the floor next to my feet. I did not make small talk. I started with June. I told them in plain language exactly what had happened on Saturday night. I told them what the temperature was. I told them how long she had been outside. I told them that Mrs. Osie's 911 call was now part of a police report, and that the responding officers had documented my father's statement, his own admission that he had asked a 9-year-old to leave the house and wait on the porch. I told them that what he had done met the legal definition of child endangerment under Illinois law, that I had consulted with an attorney, and that the question of whether to pursue charges was one I was actively considering. My father's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went, in the space of about 10 seconds, from the particular blankness he used when he wanted to project calm, to something that looked almost like fear. Clifford started to speak. I held up one hand. "I'm not finished," I said. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the coffee table. It contained a summary, carefully prepared by Sylvie, carefully reviewed by me, of the financial documentation that was now in the hands of federal investigators. Not the full investigative file, just the outline. Just enough for a man who had built his entire life around a company to understand exactly what was coming. The room was very quiet. Clifford's face had gone a particular color that I can only describe as the color of some suddenly understanding the distance between where they are and where they thought they were. My father picked up the folder. He put it down. He picked it up again. "Clifford," he said in a voice I did not recognize. Clifford said nothing. I told them about the Delaware subsidiary. I told them about the ghost employees, 11 names on payroll who did not appear to exist. I told them about the consulting LLC, which had received $4.3 million over 3.5 years, and which investigators had now traced back to 2 accounts that Clifford controlled personally. I told them that federal agents would be executing search warrants within the week, that this was not a threat I was making, but a fact I was sharing as a professional courtesy that I was absolutely not required to extend. My mother had stopped pouring coffee. She was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room with the coffee pot in her hand, and she was very still. Portia said, "You can't," and then stopped. She looked at Clifford. He did not look back at her. My father set the folder down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid that if you're not careful, your hands will shake. "How long have you known?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Long enough," I said. "That's not the point. The point is what happens next." What happened next took several months, and I am going to compress it because the legal details are dense, and because that is not really the story I am telling. The federal investigation into Hartwell Manufacturing and Clifford's embezzlement resulted in a 22-count indictment. Clifford took a plea agreement 18 months later, 7 years federal with the possibility of parole after 4. The conditions of the plea required full restitution, which meant the house Portia and Clifford owned in Hinsdale, the lake house in Wisconsin, and every investment account in Clifford's name. Portia was not charged. She lost almost everything anyway. My father cooperated with investigators. His cooperation, and the evidence that suggested he had been negligent rather than actively complicit, kept him from facing criminal charges. What it did not save was his position in the company. The board removed him as CEO 8 months after the investigation became public. The company was restructured. He retained a minority share worth a fraction of what it had once been. He did not ask me for anything during that time. I think he understood on some level that there was nothing to ask for. What he did do, and this I did not expect, was show up at my hotel the morning after our meeting in Naperville. Just him. No Clifford, no Portia, no my mother standing at the doorway with a coffee pot like a prop in a play about family dysfunction. Just my father in a coat I recognized from 10 years ago, standing in the hotel lobby, looking like a man who had not slept. I brought him up to where June was eating breakfast. I did not warn her he was coming. He sat down across from her. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked up at her. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say things when they have rehearsed them enough to stop sounding rehearsed. Which is to say, it sounded like it cost him something. He told her that what he had done was wrong. He used the specific words, "I was wrong." He did not make excuses. He did not mention the twins, or the paperweight, or the party, or anything except the fact that she was a child and he had failed to protect her and he was sorry. June looked at him for a long moment. She is 9 years old and she has her father's eyes and my grandmother's patience. She said, "Okay, Grandpa, not I forgive you, just okay," which I thought was exactly the right amount of grace for the situation. I did not say anything to him that morning. I let them have the conversation. When he stood up to leave, he looked at me across the table, not the look I had grown up with, not the look that measured and found me lacking, just a look. And I nodded once. He left. 3 weeks later, I received a document from his attorney. He had amended his estate plan to split his assets equally between me and Portia, adjusting what had previously been a 70-30 split in Portia's favor. Attached to the document was a handwritten note that said simply, "This should have always been the case." I had it framed, not out of sentiment, as a reminder that sometimes the most stunning thing a person can do is admit, finally, that they were wrong. I still have the police report from that night. Mrs. Osi sent me a Christmas card this year. She and June have stayed in touch, which is the kind of small, improbable good thing that sometimes grows out of something terrible. June starts middle school in the fall. She has a project on bioluminescent organisms due next week and has been talking about it at dinner every night for 11 days. She does not talk much about that night. When she does, she talks about Mrs. Osi's hot chocolate, which she says was the best she has ever had. She says it matter-of-factly, the way she says most things, like it is simply a fact she has filed away. That night was cold and frightening, and someone showed me kindness, and I have not forgotten. My daughter is the strongest person I know. She gets that from nobody on my father's side. I was talking to a colleague recently, another woman in federal financial crimes, someone who has been doing this longer than I have, and she asked me whether I felt guilty about the timing. Whether I had, even unconsciously, used June's situation to accelerate something that had already been in motion. Whether the professional and the personal had gotten tangled up in ways that were hard to fully examine. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. What I told her was this: I did not create the investigation. I did not manufacture the evidence. I did not do anything that was outside the bounds of what I was authorized to do as a professional with access to information I legitimately possessed. What I did do was stop waiting, stop hoping that proximity to power would eventually translate into being seen by it. Stop absorbing the weight of a family that had been telling me, in 100 different ways for 32 years, that I was less than. June was outside in 31-degree weather for 2 hours because my father decided, without a second of hesitation, that her word was worth less than the word of 2 boys who had never been told no in their lives. I stopped waiting after that. I stopped hoping, and I did my job. That is not something I feel guilty about, not even a little.